That was where we recognized there was this ultra high density of neurons, which was not in any of the textbooks. So that was the first thing. You can go look at any textbook and you shouldn't see this, sort of almost like a new organ being formed. Back in 1963, when she had this interaction, she said that in one of these dream states, the teacher presented the caudate as the center of human future evolutionary development, and that it was the locus of the antenna from which all information arises. Yeah, I had exactly that reaction. The hair on the back of my neck went up. I was like, well, of course, it's proof of nothing. But what was fascinating was at that time, the basal ganglia, and I had an argument with a Harvard-trained professor at my school about this circa 2011. No, the basal ganglia only has anything to do with, body movement. It's only body movement, nothing. She, in 1963, with no training whatsoever in the area, although she was a doctor of, physiology, had this statement that the caudate was involved in all of this other stuff around intuition. Here we are, 60 years later, and she was right. Now, she's out there a good guess, enough people out there making a guess, and so that was just remarkable. But if the isotope ratios are grossly off, it means it either came from the other side of the galaxy, perhaps, or somebody manufactured it as such. So in one of the materials, we found magnesium ratios that were just way off, just way, way off. They just couldn't be natural. And so that's not an indication that it came from a UFO. It is an indication, though, that somebody did it for a purpose, or it's the byproduct of an industrial process that caused it. And so, okay, fine, Gary, what does that mean? Well, why would anybody do it? Again, it's for me, this is let's say the discoveries that we've made have been really all about, some of these materials are ultra pure, like silicon, that is 99.999% silicon. I mean, why would you blow a piece of silicon up like that over a beach in Brazil? Why?
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So in this episode, we're going to be taking a stab at talking scientifically about the fascinating, empirically problematic, and historically controversial UFO phenomenon. Particularly fascinating these days since the US Director of National Intelligence confirmed in an official 2021 report that UAPs, as they're now called, were in fact real and a, quote, population of objects, so not just an isolated case. Many scientists and engineers are excited because the study of UFOs, regardless of their origin, could give us clues to clean energy and transportation technology that we so urgently need to combat our pollution footprint. And in fact, several patents have been granted to explore such experimental physics, if sadly for military purposes, but at least it's a start, and it could trickle down to the public in tens of years. Now, the renewed interest from the mainstream media in this topic, which led to pressure on the US government to act, started in late 2017 when the New York Times broke the story of the USS Nimitz Tic Tac incident involving craft with anomalous aerodynamic properties, witnessed by multiple highly experienced, credible pilots and radar operators. The article also revealed a Pentagon top secret advanced aerospace threat program, which wasn't supposed to exist. And the credibility of these stories has led to Congress passing a new law obliging witnesses, even with security clearances, to tell what they know, whether about Black projects trying to develop this aviation tech or about weirder possibilities. Now, apart from a short comment from Harvard astronomer and director of the Galileo project, Avi Loeb, in episode 45, and a mythological evaluation from religious studies professor Diana Pasulka in episode 53, our guest today is the first on the show to speak in detail about the scientific study of this phenomenon. But rest assured, faithful listeners, I'm not going to get obsessed with this topic and do a million shows on it. I just see it as one of the many scientific anomalies we're covering that need to be included in our theories of reality. Now, this episode is the perfect deeper dive into this topic, as my guest is going to be speaking about two pieces of physical evidence which he studied, so often absent in the claims about this phenomenon. Firstly, MRI scans and blood samples of experiences from the military and intelligence services who had alleged interactions with UFOs. And secondly, anomalous fragments of alloys recovered from alleged UFO encounter sites. Being a science podcast, the data of physical evidence is always our first port of call. But as so often, when discussing anomalous phenomena that don't fit our current worldview, the interpretations of that data are various and contradictory. But today's guest is the perfect person to present us this data, as he is the one who was contacted by US intelligence because he invented the equipment they needed to analyze that data. He's not shy of the possible implications of the data, while equally in no hurry to jump to any conclusions till we have confirming proof, both measures of a good scientist in my opinion. He is, of course, the chair of the Department of Pathology and part of the Cancer Immunology Department at Stanford University School of Medicine, Dr. Garry P. Nolan. He's published over 330 academic papers. He holds 50 patents and has founded 8 biotech companies. Now, listeners, please do use the show notes should anyone out there want to go and check the authority of the research and the ideas that we're talking about here on the show. On the website are even more if I can't fit them all in on the platforms. Please use them. It's really, really important for me as a science show that any claims here on the show are well referenced, even if I don't necessarily agree with them all. A quick thank you for all of your support on the project so far. Please keep spreading the word, sharing the show with your friends, with your colleagues. You guys are my marketing. I don't do any marketing. Give us 5 stars if you're on Spotify or on iTunes, or subscribe with the bell if you're listening on YouTube. It really helps the algorithms get it to like minds like yourselves who are going to enjoy the show. So I'd really appreciate that. Hit me up on Facebook and Instagram if you want to hear about the shows as they're coming out. Feedback with your ideas, with your guest suggestions, and feel free to leave your opinion about these topics as well, because it's really good to get the feedback of the listeners and not just the guests. Now, I've wanted to speak to Garry about what I think are 2 very meaningful pieces of physical evidence ever since I first read about his research in Vice magazine, especially considering he's been dismissive in his analysis of other samples that turned out not to be anomalous in the past, which for me is a sign of integrity over make-believe. So I just can't wait to get into this. So without further ado, let's go. Dr. Garry Nolan, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. Thanks for joining us. How are you today?
Great. Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
It is our great pleasure. Now, I often start by asking my guests about the very first deep philosophical questions that rattle around in their head when they just became conscious of their own thinking as a kid or as an adolescent. What were the first ideas you can remember from that time that seem relevant, given what you've ended up being really interested in?
Well, I remember, and this obviously is related to my interests, one of my interests today. I remember reading a National Geographic. I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and I opened up the National Geographic, and it was about, astronomy and the structure of the universe as we understood it at the time. I mean, this would have been, frankly, circa 1968. And our view of what we thought was the universe maybe went as far as the local, some of the local cluster galaxies, Andromeda, et cetera. And there was a picture. It was obviously not a real picture, but it was sort of an artist's rendition of the local universe as we understood it. I just remember sitting there thinking at that time, what kinds of uh, great dramas might have played out across that expanse, the civilizations that rose and fall. And I was honestly, I was 8 years old, and I don't know where that idea came from, but it was just, I looked at it and I thought of the time involved in the creation of it and thinking, wow, what's our place in that? We're such a small piece, but what other histories have been written out there? And that to me was the first thing to realize that, in seeing a picture like that, you realize simultaneously that you're both smaller and larger than you were before. You're smaller because you see yourself against the comparison of all of that, but you're larger because you realize that there's probably stories out there to which you can relate.
Mm. So tell us briefly, Gary, about some of your career as an immunologist and a pathologist, just so the listeners know your background. I know you've been involved in the creation of a new technique to modify the genetics of cells, and you've been involved in cancer research. And tell us about your inventions too, because they relate to why you were contacted to study these brain and blood samples and alloys.
Right. So I started as a geneticist, actually a plant geneticist at Cornell undergrad. I came to Stanford for my PhD. I intended on working with a guy by the name of Stanley Cohen, who had been the first to develop recombinant DNA technology, and he has the Cohen-Boyer patents that were one of the biggest patents at Stanford monetarily, and of course they changed the nature of the biotechnology industry here in the Valley. But I ended up working in Len Herzenberg's lab, Len and Leonore Herzenberg, husband-wife team, who had developed an instrument called the flow cytometer, the fluorescence activated flow cytometer, which I won't go into. But if you ever go in and get your blood done and drawn, and they come back and they say, this is how many T cells, B cells, et cetera, you have, that was their device. And so, during my whole graduate school, I was pretty much inculcated in two things. One, the Herzenbergs had a very hippie, liberal, accept everybody for their merit. Don't give anybody anything because of who and what they are, but just it's a merit-based approach. And don't discard somebody just because they don't look like what you think a scientist should be. And that created a community in their laboratory of some extraordinary thinkers. So nothing was off limits. But they had created another industry. They had the two other biggest patents at Stanford, the flow cytometer itself and what are called humanized antibodies. So all the immunotherapies that are basically antibody-based today were based on stuff that came out of their lab. So as much as they were hippie, near Marxist in some of their way of thinking, they were also extreme capitalists in terms of making sure that these ideas made it out through not giving it away, but by commercializing it in an ethical manner. And so I saw a lot of how you do this kind of work across the academic commercial divide. And so I went then to work with this guy by the name of David Baltimore at MIT, who was at the time really one of the most important molecular biologists, had won the Nobel Prize for retrovirology, for how a certain kind of virus replicates. And it was around that time that I had developed one of my first big technologies, which I did in collaboration with another guy by the name of Warren Pear in the lab. And it was based on something that at the time he couldn't do and he wanted to do, which was to transfer genes easily into a target cell to measure what happened when this oncogene, this cancer-forming gene, would be expressed in a cell. And it just it was just slow and tedious. And I realized, hey, I have a way that maybe it can be done faster. And, so he and I worked on it together. We took a 3-month process down to 3 days. And that then became the ignitus for what is now today still the standard by which retroviruses and lentiviruses are delivered to cells. So all gene therapy done on all humans and all patients and all CRISPR screens and things that everybody does are done with a technology that I had created, thought up, and then worked with Warren to develop years ago. I mean, 3 decades ago, frankly, now. It was 1993, 4 or so. And I saw out of that a that it there's two ways that science advances. One, by understanding new principles of how something operates. We understand something about the nature of the universe and physics, and so with that, we then develop transistors. Or you're the person who develops the transistor, right? That you look at the practicality of something that could be done. So you either create the basic knowledge and let somebody else do the development for you, or you decide what it is that you want to develop, or you realize that there's a technological requirement, and so then you search for ways to achieve it. So I end up being more on this side of the science equation, more the tinkerer that says, oh, well, gee, I really want to do that. Everybody's doing this. That's going to take you 5 years. It'll take me 2 years to figure out how to do it faster, and then I'll give everybody the ability to do it faster. And so that was the retrovirus. That was what's called phosphoflow, CyTOF, MIB, Codex, the split pool synthesis approach. All things that everybody in the immunology and cell biology field knows me for, because just collecting data is important, but if you have a sharper or better way to collect the data that's more informative and closer to the truth of what the data means, that's worth the time and effort. But the flip side of that, though, is to create more data creates more problems. You have to actually understand the data. Data doesn't equal information, nor does that equal knowledge or wisdom. So you're always trying to move up that curve: data, information, knowledge, wisdom. And so now I've sort of come full circle back to some of my computational roots, where I'm actually switching much of the efforts of my laboratory over onto the computational side, because the large language models, et cetera, are enabling some extraordinary capabilities. And so I sort of feel like, hey, this is worth my time and effort to do, because nobody else is thinking about it the way that I am, because we're the ones who gave them the ability to do it, and they don't even realize the problem that they're in. They're all excited about just collecting this data. I've already been collecting that data, but I now realize the problem, and so I want to get ahead of it in that sense. So that's really what it's been. But in all of these cases, we've spun out companies, because again, the academic enterprise is really not fit for turning a complex technology into something which is easy. You can put a recipe on a website of how to make a cake, but you give that recipe to 1,000 people, and some people will be a disaster, and some people will be, something else. But give the recipe to a commercial enterprise, and they can spit out 1,000 cakes a day that are all equivalent. So that's kind of the way that I try to work. And some of these instruments we make are very complex and cost millions of dollars to make. So it's not something that every laboratory can do. So it's how to merge the best aspects of the commercial with the academic opportunity, because I feel strongly that scientists mostly are invested in by the public, and so it's fine to say, hey, knowledge for knowledge's sake, but in a way, it behooves you to give back some way, clearly and openly, to the public who's funding your your Sundays.
Definitely. So before we get into the physical evidence of your study of experiences brains and of the anomalous alloys and some of the speculative hypotheses for the causes of these physical bits of evidence, I want to set the context for this often scientifically completely dismissed topic with a word on Thomas Kuhn, a physicist, historian, philosopher of science, somebody who I know has influenced you, who wrote the influential book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Now, according to Kuhn, paradigm shifts in science do not happen through gradual study. On the contrary, they happen when there's a sudden shift in understanding or a complete change in perception. And he likens this process to a gestalt shift in psychology, when your perception of something suddenly and completely changes. And the scientists who forward these new ideas tend to either be young or at least new to the field, which makes them less committed to the current methods and rules, and so less resistant to change in their older colleagues. Now, why do I mention this? Because for me, being humble in the face of the sheer scale of the unknown and open to new data and hypotheses that could explain what we don't yet know seems to be at the center, not only of the process of scientific progress, but also being the scientist to imagine those possible explanations and therefore succeeding with new innovations where other closed-minded scientists may have failed. How much has Kuhn's conception of scientific revolution influenced the way you do your research and your imagination methodology when it comes to solving new problems, like in the way that your inventions have?
Well, it's funny because just like in the UAP or UFO research that I do, even in my conventional work, I see every day the terrorism that the uh, granting agencies often inflict upon the researcher, because often your grant proposal will go to a committee of people who it isn't necessarily in their best interest to see to it that anybody gets a grant. It's often in the best interest of the people around the table to strut their ego. Because I've been on these committees, and I don't often see them trying to enable an idea. They don't look for the value always in an idea. They're often looking for a way to cut the idea down, which I don't understand. Because for me, I look at an idea and I go, okay, they might not have put it all together in the right way, but is there a kernel of opportunity in this idea? And so, in the context of Kuhn, when you have an idea that flies in the face of current understanding, the psychological, let's say, mindset of the average reviewer is to marshal every form of skepticism they have to keep the common understanding whole. Now, there's value to that, as long as it doesn't become the credo of how you do things. You put the idea up against reasonable skepticism, but equal to that, at least in my mind, is, well, I should play devil's advocate for the new idea, and I should look for every reason why the current mindset is wrong. Right. So you need to be able to be on both sides. And unfortunately, too many scientists only stay on the side of the current understanding and don't realize that it is really the best goal of using their mind is to be also on the other side, to play both the pro and the con. Um, because sometimes those new views and switch of perspective helps you put into context a greater understanding of many things that weren't falling into place. And Kuhn's idea in the structure of scientific revolution is basically that you have a new idea, it you think explains better than all the other things that are out there, current understanding, but it usually takes multiple small changes where the weight of the evidence, not just the thing that you're talking about, but all the other evidentiary data that's collected, uh, piles up to the point where it is irrefutable. And then suddenly everything falls. And then on the other side of that, all the people who used to say, "Oh well, I didn't believe it," they're suddenly on their other side. "Oh well, of course it was obvious," And it's very much akin to the old Gandhi, trope of first they deny you, etc. It's just the scientific version of that, of the pushback effect, and then finally they accept. And it's like the stages of grief. It's a similar concept.
But there's also a question here about imagination and intuition, which I know is going to come back into the conversation in a little while when we talk about some of these experiences' brains. But in a way, one needs to be able to let go of all of your study and all your preconceived ideas if you're going to arrive to the destination in a new way. Because if I'm departing from the current understanding and trying to head towards my objective, then I'm in the same place as everybody else. Whereas if I work my way back in a very, very imaginative and completely letting go of all of the knowledge kind of way, I'm actually more likely to come up with an imaginative solution. And I understand that that's quite important for you. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you have to be able. Look, the way that I solve problems, and this is what I was just telling somebody. I actually tell students often. You have a problem. You have to. A good scientist can instantly come up with 1,000 hypotheses, right? And then rank order them in their mind according to like what is most likely, all the way down to micrognomes run the universe, right? And of course, that's probably the most unlikely. But you don't dismiss it. You just put a series of cutoffs to say micrognomes is possible, unprovable. Possible things, but hard to prove, or not within the scope of my experimental means to prove. And then above a certain threshold are things that are likely and provable. And so by being able to instantly categorize and then rank order, you come up with a series of questions and ways of thinking about the problem that immediately give rise to the experiments that you can do to prove or disprove them. And something I learned early on is that the questions are often not yes or no. That sometimes if the answer is no, you just wasted 6 months. You're only looking for yes. And so those are what I would call Las Vegas questions, right? Roulette table, yes, black, I win, red, no, I lose. Sometimes just by looking and thinking about the question, you can ask the question in a way that no matter what the answer is, it's interesting. So you're always progressing. And so it's a bit of a Zen martial arts move to finesse how you ask the question, because then you're always going forward. So you can take a yes no question and turn it into a high information output goal. And then, of course, you have to use that to context a better understanding of reality. And so, in the context of UAP, there's more. I mean, the debunkers and denialists notwithstanding, there is so much preliminary data out there that if anybody even just spent a couple of days looking at it, would perhaps not walk away convinced, but walk away realizing that it's a question worth asking because there are enough observations that tell you, there's something here. I mean, I published now, I don't know, I think something like 380 papers. And so I'm a consummate scientist. I'm a skeptic. I eat the papers alive with my students to make sure that we have covered every nook and cranny of the opportunity and make sure that we caveat everything. I mean, to me, this area just screams interesting. And do I have enough data personally? No. Do I have conviction? As much conviction as I do with any of my scientific hypotheses that I've made a career on. But what I think is interesting that a lot of people out there don't realize is the asymmetry of the argument. The people who make the claim, let's say that somebody sees something, or let's say you're in the field and you have a series of observations that have multiple simultaneous, let's say, radar and visuals, etc. A group, in the Department of Defense, ARROW, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office that people can go read about, which is supposedly the UFO UAP investigation division of the Department of Defense, will put out a white paper like they did recently. And they'll say, well, we looked at this and our conclusion is it's most likely to be nothing, or most likely to be a balloon. Okay, first of all, science doesn't work by most likely, right? That's a form of that's a logical fallacy approach that you are really just not allowed to use in science. Second, people on, let's say, that side of the equation are always saying, well, where's your data? Where's your proof? Well, I've just given you all the data. You've come to a conclusion. Where's your data that you've used to come to a conclusion that these things are wrong? And where's your methodology? They never will produce their methodology. They have not produced their methodology. So that's actually, in pure science, that's fraud. If I were to try to do that as a scientist, I would lose my job, right? But they're allowed to do it. And then, of course, they go to willing, journalists who will, parrot what they say. And so, unfortunately, that creates a bit of a perception problem in the media. But, you really have to listen to the words of what they're saying to realize that what in reality they are doing, whether it's purposeful for disinformation or not, is that they are the people on that Kuhnian curve pushing back and saying that, no, I'm just going to ignore the data, or I'm going to cherry pick one thing that might be wrong. I'm going to say that if you can't prove this, the whole thing is wrong. Take everything else out of context. So they are the people on this side of the Kuhnian curve pushing back. Why? We could probably spend 3 hours talking about all the reasons why.
I'm less interested in the sociological and the pushback. I just thought it was important to mention Kuhn as a starting point, because we could understand how the missing piece here could just come all at once, and that we shouldn't feel that this overwhelming pushback and this huge amount of taboo isn't going to change when we get the little bit of proof that we need. So with that backdrop of your long and successful career set, we can get into the story of your research and the data that you have analyzed on this. And listeners, do just bear with me a moment, because I'm just going to tell a bit of a story here so Garry doesn't have to repeat the story. It's a story that's been out for quite some years. It was in Vice magazine, and it started about 15 years ago with the bizarre bone mutations of the Atacama skeleton, which led to some people in the UFO field thinking that it was alien in origin. And Garry reached out to offer your lab's unique instruments to analyze it. And it turned out to be human. And although the UFO buffs were frustrated about this, calling you a debunker, i.e. setting out with an agenda to disprove it, it caught the attention of the scientific community, who had been studying this stuff scientifically for quite a few years, more or less secretly. People like physicist and DARPA researcher Hal Puthoff, CIA scientist Kit Green, aerospace millionaire Robert Bigelow, physicist and propulsion expert Eric Davis, and perhaps most publicly involved in UFOs, computer scientist and author Jacques Valee. Now, all of them knew that your expertise and this equipment could be really handy, so it didn't take long for them to come along with something for you to have a look at. And after that Atacama story went so public, Green approached you with a blood analysis of 100 military cases, pilots, intelligence agents, ground personnel who'd got close to these alleged UFOs and their electromagnetic fields and were suffering a wide range of different symptoms. Now, the MRIs that came with those case files showed what first looked like terrible brain damage, but on closer inspection, you found that it couldn't be that because the damage was in the area of this basal ganglia, important to core brain functioning, among other things. And if it was damaged, these people would be dead. And some of them had died from their injuries, but the majority were alive. So tell us, Garry, about this overconnection of neurons that you went on to discover what appears to be an uncommon structure in the human brain. So we don't all have it. I won't share the image now, listeners, as I don't want to leave out the audio files who aren't on YouTube, but it is going to be on our Instagram and our Facebook page. What did you find, Garry? And were you able to determine whether this was a mutation caused by the experience, the electromagnetic fields or the radiation, or were you able to determine if this was something that they'd had since birth?
So let me go back a little bit and modify a little of what you said about the group of 100 or so patients. They started as a group of patients that, let's call it, they were in the weird bucket. This was all kinds of damage that had happened, everything from hearing things and buzzing in their head, headaches, etc., to people who claimed, and as well as separately people who claimed that they'd seen things, all of whom had some kind of anomalous damage to them. Without going through all the rigorous work that was done, 85 of them or so ended up being what we can only interpret today as Havana Syndrome. Okay, so and none of those people had seen UFOs. Okay, that left 15 people who had similar kinds of damage, but had claimed some sort of anomalous interaction. Right now, the damage is fairly nonspecific: burns on their bodies, internal scarring due to some kind of electromagnetic radiation, etc. So it was easy at the beginning when you don't know what's going on, and some of these cases stretched back into the early 2000s, to just put them in the bucket of I don't know what to do with these people. And I went and interviewed some of these people. It was pretty clear that this was all real. And I know the CIA doesn't want to talk about Havana Syndrome, but there's a huge controversy going on around that alone. And it's real, so I don't care what anybody says, because I've seen some of the patients. But skip all of that. To the point of what you said about the things in the brain that we saw. So as we were looking at the brain scans, and I remember just there being 2 scans up on the projector, and right in the middle, we noticed a common density that could, under the wrong circumstances, be thought of as damage. So as you said, we thought, okay, well, wow, is this the common damage that we're seeing? But then when we looked into it deeper, and you can kind of flip how you look at the MRIs, you realize, no, this is actually living tissue. That was where we recognized there was this ultra high density of neurons, which was not in any of the textbooks. So that was the first thing. You can go look at any textbook and you shouldn't see this, sort of almost like a new organ being formed. And it was extra connections between the head of the caudate and the putamen. Fast forward a little bit, we happen to have some of the MRIs of so-called remote viewers. Okay, now remote viewers is these were people who were part of a CIA program for, I know this sounds crazy to your people, there was a CIA program for psychic vision, and there was to spy on the Soviets. You can go read about it. And it was a real program, and it had real outcomes, and it's not fake, and it seemed to work, but not in enough of a predictable manner that they could use it. But we had the MRIs of those individuals, and so we said, hey, let's just look at them. And lo and behold, 2 of these individuals had, if you were to put it on a scale, they had the highest of the densities. And so it kind of clicked in our head that maybe what we are actually seeing here is some sort of a form of intelligence or intuition. that is sort of, we intuited that this area of the brain might be involved at the very least in intelligence, but also if you think about, let's say that these so-called remote viewers, they're really not psychic. They're just really good at picking up clues and putting them together. And that's what intuition is sort of like pulling ideas out of abstract relationships that is going on subconsciously. So then we began to look into the literature a little bit. And in the literature, it was already becoming understood that, in fact, the basal ganglia and the caudate putamen is directly associated with an intuition. And in fact, this area of the brain lights up when chess players make that move that nobody would expect, sort of like the aha moment. The aha moment lights up your basal ganglia. So what does the basal ganglia do with the caudate putamen? It's actually at the center of your motor sensory apparatus. So, in fact, if you were to talk to a neurophysiologist pre 2000, they would tell you, yeah, it's all about motor, has nothing to do with anything else. Post 2000, people began to realize, well, to move my arm, I need to know where my arm is. I need to know that my arm is not going to hit the computer screen. I need to know what my intent is. I need to be subservient and downstream of the executive function. I need to have a memory. I mean, I can turn this way and know that I can't move my hand this way because I know that I'm going to hit the screen. So all that subconscious processing, your emotions, thoughts, memories, etc., all have to be integrated in some place that will form goals on how it is that you move. So when you move across the room at a party, your basal ganglia is in overdrive. It's just doing all the movements based on, I want to go over there. You send that down to your basal ganglia. It reaches out into your body to say, what can you do? And then it forms a goal set and it moves everything for you. So if you had to place intuition anywhere where you have to integrate multiple things simultaneously, you would put it in a place like the basal ganglia because it is still using memory, goals, desires, et cetera, because it has this goal planning ability underneath. If you were to place psi, whatever that is the place again that you would put it, because if you're getting anomalous information from the environment somehow, it has to overlay into your sensory apparatus somewhere. So this would be the place where, for instance, that information could be imprinted as an engram of some sort, or a glyph, as I often call them, that somehow the information goes from over there to over here, where we think we understand it over here in how our brains operate. We didn't understand, and we still don't understand where the information might come from over there. And I'm fully open to the idea that it has nothing to do with anything paranormal. It has only to do with that you're just darn good at putting together the pieces of the puzzle from fragments of information that you have in your past or you're picking up versus, it's some sort of, psychic power or woo that we don't understand.
And also, I think you confirmed that many of their family members also had this same thing and thus excluded the possibility that this change in the brain had been caused by any exposure or any damage. Is that right? You managed to
Yes.
identify that?
Yes. So what we did was, once we had the brain images of all these people and we'd rank ordered them, the first thing we found out that in doing a independent intelligence test on these people, that they were all, I wouldn't call them all savants, but they were all in the ultra high performing range.
IQ you're talking about now.
IQ, yeah. And military pilots, et cetera. I mean, you're no dummy if you're going to be flying you're making split-second decisions that are below the level of consciousness. And or they were very high-performing scientists, et cetera. Then we went and looked at, and by the way, the numbers game is that about 1 in 100 to 1 in 200 people have this.
Oh.
Right. So that actually comports with intelligence quotients, in the 120 and above numbers. And then when we looked at husbands and wives, out of a group of about 10 husband wives, 2 of them both had it, the husband and the wife. So run the numbers, you know, 2 out of 10 couples have it, where only 1 in 100 people are supposed to have it. The statistics just don't add up, meaning that there are, at the very least, well, I mean, you could just say smart people are attracted to smart people, right? But the big surprise was when we looked at their children. Their children had it, which meant that it was a very, and it was actually, we actually found cases where, like, the father would have it and the children would both have it, or the mother would have it and the children would both have it, meaning it is a near dominant trait, right? Or the complex of genes that controls it is very closely aligned in a manner that supports when you have children, they're much more likely to have it. Which is interesting because it means that some aspects of intelligence can be passed on genetically. I mean, I don't think anybody would be surprised with that. You know, musical ability runs in families, etc. So no surprise there. But what we did was then we worked with a Harvard lab who specializes in brain analysis. Specifically, they were interested in autism. Because what we wanted to do, I mean, there's no way I would be able to get a grant on studying paranormal abilities, right? So you have to write and study this in a manner that is supported by normal mainstream science. So we said, look, okay, we have an ability to map brain regions now, the MRIs with automated AI. You know, so we developed this like 5 years ago before other people did. And we said, let's look at a bunch of normals. Let's look at a cohort of people on the autistic spectrum. Let's look at a bunch of people who are on the schizophrenic spectrum. Because at the very least, then what we're doing is we're doing real science that's going to help lots of people. But what we were interested in was specifically, and the hypothesis was that the caudate putamen would be involved somehow because it's a perception integrator, as I spoke about before. The other utility is that on the spectrum towards full, let's say, mental health problem, schizophrenia, is an awful lot of creativity, right? So, you know, we often talk about the artist being a bit, you know, getting a bit crazy, but that's where creativity goes, right? On the other end, in autism, is a kind of focus and mental acuity that we know is the case for people on the autistic spectrum. You go all the way out to the savants who can't reasonably function in society, but could give you the square root of some giant number to the 50th decimal point instantly. Okay, so how and where do they do that? So we don't know. That doesn't mean that it's woo, doesn't mean it's paranormal. It just means that those are interesting comparators on the different kinds of intellects that we prize in human society. And so we did that. And lo and behold, we find that the caudate was important in both of them, as well as in the normals, for predicting function, ability, and dysfunction. But then we also found, because we were able to map all the regions at once, that there's kind of a push me, pull you going on. There's not just the caudate, but that if the caudate was larger, there was a corresponding change elsewhere, and that the neural tracts between them that are carrying information would correspondingly change in size as well. So what we're doing is beginning to realize that everybody knows the brain is a system. There's no one size fits all answer for what intelligence is, but that there's this morphing of the brain and the brain regions and how they communicate with each other that is in total a better predictor of capability. And where we're going with that now is in so understanding these operations of how the brain is working, is, you know, there are ways you can reach into the brain without surgery, transcranial stimulation of a variety of types, to, if we can map these brain regions and say, okay, well, here's a function we want to tweak a little bit better. Maybe we can, you know, temporarily give people a boost in creativity, or in the case of how we understand autists to operate. Maybe we can take a non-autistic individual and give them momentarily the higher functionality. I don't know that we can, but when you see it, and if you're like me, you think of, okay, well, what do I do with it? Can I do this? You can just imagine that there might be ways to tweak brain function, but it wouldn't be the first thing I do, obviously. I think, want to prepare the path by showing that you can use this information to help people who are sick, right? That if a person with a certain kind of schizophrenia is getting too much information and one of their brain regions is super active, maybe you use a form of transcranial stimulation to turn off the neural tracts that are either leading into or out of the incorrectly operating regions. So, but then of course, then there's drugs. Can you design drugs to tweak different areas of the brain? The problem I have with drugs is, as we all know, the brain especially, there's all these antidepressants and all kinds of things out there, and every one of them affects people differently. People's, brain chemistry is so different that I don't think we're going to take it or find instant access drugs to make people powerfully intuitive. But I would prefer personally to think about the transcranial stimulation approaches. And I'm not the only one doing this or thinking about it. I know of at least probably 5 startups here in the Bay Area alone that are looking into this.
Wow. What an extraordinary sort of by mistake finding from this
Yeah.
very weird cohort. Now, coming back to the UAP thing, though, did every person who saw these things have that brain feature? And were there cases of collective sightings in which you could confirm that those without this brain structure didn't see something, whereas those with the structure did see it? Were you able to confirm that?
No, there was not. No, there was none of. We didn't have such a luck to have access to such people. Certainly, of the 15, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was above the statistical expectation, right? That they had them. I don't think that this brain region allows you to see them. I think having this brain region allows you to see data which is off the curve and recognize it as something important. It's kind of like the mirror test for animals. Only at a certain level of intelligence can an animal look into the mirror and recognize eventually that it's them that they're seeing, the perception of self. And so I think that this is like an intelligence threshold. Can you look at something and realize that's not supposed to be there? If a monkey saw a UFO over a tree, it would probably go, okay, I'm going to go hide maybe, or maybe it would ignore it as long as it isn't coming close. At some level of intelligence, somebody's going to look at it and go, what the heck is that? And maybe try to poke at it. And so it's perception of something in the environment that is out of context. As that scientist, I forget it, Hoffman, I think is his name, says that the senses are there to limit your exposure to the universe, not to enhance it. And it's to just be there to make sure you don't die in the process of passing on your genes, on your way to passing on your genes.
And we'll come back to the default mode network, which is very important in inhibiting this vast amount of potential input that could confuse us in our quotidian reality. We'll come back to that in a moment. So this genetic component of their relations, having this unique brain feature too, invites a hypothesis that people with certain types of brains and genetics could have a predisposition, not necessarily that it permits it, but it is a predisposition to these types of, shall we say, anomalous experiences. And Kit Green mentioned something similar to this in the documentary Third Eye Spies about remote viewing.
Mhm.
that I think long before you discussed this with Kit, the CIA had been interested in finding the common denominator in talented viewers that could be used to do physical tests and identify potentially talented operatives in the future. And this kind of approach to UFO experiences is sometimes called the antenna hypothesis.
Mhm.
And in order to entertain such a possibility, we need to accept something that your friend and colleague, physicist Jacques Valee, has hypothesized about. Now, listeners, most of you will know who is Jacques Valee, but just for those of you who haven't heard of him, he is respected physicist and DARPA computer scientist who was involved in the creation of the DARPANET, the military precursor to the internet, who reported on the UFO phenomena to the UN Special Committee, Political Committee in '79, and is perhaps probably the most experienced and publicly open of all scientists studying UFOs, going right back to the '60s. Now, Jacques has hypothesized that, by no means conclusively, much to the frustration of those in the community desperate to see this acknowledged as a real physical phenomena by the authorities, that it's both physical and psychological, and so at least partly a phenomenon of consciousness. Now, I know that sounds weird, listeners. How could it be both physically there, visible in the atmosphere and on radar scopes, and yet also a phenomenon of consciousness? But Jack's been studying this for such a long time. What's your take on this, Garry? Would you speculate an antenna hypothesis following these 15 or so brains that you studied? And if not, where on the arc between physical and psychological has your hypothesis settled on this data?
Well, I'm definitely a devotee of Jacques, who's an extremely good friend of mine. In fact, I just saw him at lunch just a few days ago, and I see him regularly. Um, I think why he got started on all of this is that I remember reading some of his books before I'd ever met him, and I was like, why is every other paragraph? Why is he using the word absurd? That these experiences that people have are absurd, and he lays them out. I mean, any normal person would say, okay, why did a UFO land in a farmer's field? A little guy gets out in a silver suit, opens up the backside as if it's the trunk of a car, and mucks around in it and gets back in and leaves. I mean, it's absurd. Uh, it, and there's hundreds of examples of this, and many of them plucked right out of the newspapers from like the Midwest from the early 1900s. You know, Joe Farmer X, an otherwise upstanding citizen of the community, reports the following. And so Jacques goes through enough of these and says, this is absurd. This is an influence campaign more than anything else, that these are what he would call kabuki theater. These are theatrical puppeteering events meant to influence somebody. Now, that sounds absurd in and of itself, but how else do you explain so many of the observations? So there's this divide in the people in the community of those who want it to only be material. And in fact, I only talk to my colleagues in science about it as a material matter, because there are materials associated with the stuff. There are claimed to be craft. I mean, I have a dozen or so or more materials that were sort of claimed to be left behind that I studied. Um, and there's technology supposedly behind closed doors that the government does an awful lot of twisting and turning itself into pretzels to not talk about. And then there's all these, let's say, more abstract concepts of, well, what would an advanced civilization be capable of doing if it wanted to talk to us? And what would be the medium by which it would interact with us? And so Jacques' contention is that, as strange as this sounds, the medium is the message, right? The medium and the form that it takes and how that it's interacting with us is basically telling us that this is what you're seeing, a message, and is not in and of itself real. And if anything, it's an intelligence test for you to determine, do you recognize what it is that's right in front of you for what it is? right? So there's layers here. There's a show that's being put on for you that's meant to influence you, at least at a first order interaction. I'm seeing an alien landing in my field. Okay. But it's impossible that they would do that if they're so advanced. So what does that mean? So what's the higher level message that might be conferred? And that's really what Jaques has been about, to say, look, that there's a higher level message here that is we're being interacted with, and in some ways he calls it the control hypothesis, that we're being maneuvered. And again, this comes back to and it was that allowed me in discussions with Jaques to realize that intelligence is less about what you're able to do as opposed to what it is you're able to perceive about what it is that you're seeing and conclude from what it is that you're seeing. I mean, I always, in my laboratory group meetings once a week, it's always the data off the curve that I annoy the students with. It's like, wait a second, what does that mean over there? How do you explain that? Because when I see that, I either think a mistake was made or our worldview is wrong. And so I'm more interested in the data off the curve than I am the data on the curve. And again, that all circles back to the Kuhnian thing that you started this whole discussion off with. So, I'm somewhere in between on it. I mean, I'm definitely working on the material aspect, because however it is that this stuff manifests itself for us, it does appear to have a material aspect. Now, I don't know whether they're just cardboard cutouts or whether they're actually, a technology. Uh, I'm pretty sure that whatever it is that we're interacting with in terms of what people think are beings or people or whatever, I don't think they're actually what is behind the scenes. Because I just can't believe that something coming from another star looks like a human. It's just the genetics don't compute, right? Or that 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head are the necessary format for anything to be intelligent and be a starfaring civilization. Star Trek aside, and all the humanoid looking things that they have. So it's like, okay, so well, and maybe what it is something that is like a super intelligent AI, that it realizes it needs to talk to us. So it's not going to send a monster down. It's going to send something that looks like us or close enough to us that it can interact with us. And yet, though, the discussions that these things are claimed to have had, with, again, going back to some of these reports from the early 1900s, et cetera, which I think are the most valuable because they're the least contaminated by the zeitgeist of public knowledge about UAP, is, this spaceman walks up, knocks on the door, says, "Can I have a glass of water?" Takes the water and goes back. Or, "What time is it?" It's 12 o'clock. "What day is it?" "Wednesday." The guy says, "No, it's not," and turns around and walks away. Right. So what is that message meant to convey? And so, you're left with, as Jaques would often say, you're left with a set of circumstances no reasonable hypothesis can cover all of the observations. And in science, what we know is that if one observation is against the theory is wrong. So the only way that he can write an umbrella observation is to say all of these things are absurd, and they're just set up to tell us to think about a higher level explanation for it. And that's kind of the sum of what his operating principles are, that I think at a high level has to be operating somewhere. Or the other possibility, just real brief, is I often said, well, is it one thing or is it many things? is it one controlling intelligence, or are there many things? And that's the explanation of why there's so much difference here. And of course, Jacques gave me the absolutely annoying answer, which was, well, maybe it's one thing pretending to be many things.
But Jacques also talks about this idea of, any sufficiently advanced technology could project what
Mhm.
our idea of projection is whatever cinema, or even more recently, maybe a hologram, but actually a really advanced one that understands space time and gravity and stuff could maybe even just project something into physical reality.
Exactly.
But the question I have about the antenna hypothesis, and I want to ask your opinion about Tyler D from Diana's book that you met, I imagine, on quite a few occasions. And
Mhm.
he subscribes to the antenna hypothesis. The question is that projection that Jack talks about, who sees that and who doesn't? And does everybody see it? Because it appears that there are many stories where some people see it collectively, quite a few people see it, but not everybody sees it. So it seems like that projection is not universally seen, and therefore there is an antenna possibility. And I know
Mhm.
that Tyler ventures this idea that I thought was absolutely beautiful, that DNA stores biophotonic data and has a natural frequency, meaning that our bodies could be programmable through resonant frequency and then could act as a transmitter and a receiver, not far from the antenna hypothesis. Were you influenced by Tyler's thinking, and does it seem appealing?
The DNA as an antenna, I don't know. It it I just don't know about that. I mean, I'm actually more on the ORC side of Penrose and Hameroff, as where there might be an interface with other information exchange. The antenna that I have talked, at least where Tim and I have comport, is that the brain somewhere is the center of an antenna. That the whatever those sensory apparatus that I talked about that eventually lead into the basal ganglia, those are the antenna. There's a book I have here, um, that shocked the heck out of me when we had first thought about the basal ganglia as being the center of all of the caudate putamen. I went to the Google and started typing in all the names of the various regions of the brain, psychic power, everyone. And so, of course, the one that comes up the most is the pineal gland, which everybody seems to, that's the one that comes up the most. Um, but I came, across this book, through the curtain, and by these two women. And Dr. Neal had claimed to go into these sort of meditative states where she would talk to or go to a night class, as she would say it, in dreams. And remarkably, what Google, sort of associated was that back in 1963, when she had this interaction, she said that in one of these dream states, the teacher presented the caudate as the center of human future evolutionary development, and that it was the locus of the antenna from which all information arises. Yeah, I had exactly that reaction. The hair on the back of my neck went up. I was like, well, of course, it's proof of nothing. But what was fascinating was at that time, the basal ganglia, and I had an argument with a Harvard trained professor at my school about this circa 2011. No, the basal ganglia only has anything to do with, body movement. It's only body movement, nothing. She, in 1963, with no training whatsoever in the area, although she was a doctor of, physiology, had this statement that the caudate was involved in all of this other stuff around intuition. Here we are 60 years later, and she was right. Now, she's out there a good guess, enough people out there making a guess, or, and so that was just remarkable.
And it also
Um,
brings us to this idea that maybe the antenna analogy isn't just a question of psychic or experiencer level information. It's about information in general, a sort of non-local antenna for information at large. And I think that's a fascinating idea. Now, Garry, I must move on to your
Please.
work on metals because I know you've got to go, and I've got to get this in for the listeners.
Mhm,
Because there is an important physical element here through the alloys. Thanks for
mhm,
bearing with us, the hard scientist, while we
mhm,
amble off there into the high grass of sort of belief and subjective experience and psychology. But hard evidence is always pleasing for science geeks
mhm.
like us because it's real evidence. It's not videos. It's not photos. It's not subjective experience. So again, you were asked, because of your inventions used to see this at the microscopic pixel level, using mass spectrometry and flow cytometry to analyze material to find out if it was naturally occurring or manufactured or alloys that humans couldn't make.
Right.
Where did these samples come from, and what did you find when you put them inside your machines?
Yeah. So to the point, and so to the hard scientists out there, as much as I enjoy all of this other stuff, at the end of the day, these anecdotes need to be translated over into scientific understanding if they're to be, you know, talked about scientifically. So the only things that I've really ever studied have been either the reproducible biology of people who've been harmed, where I can go back and take the same picture of their brains tomorrow and it shows the same result, or the material aspect, as you say, of some of these metals or claimed leftovers from some of the craft. So all of the materials that I have a chain of evidence and witness observation trail that would survive a court and jury. So, I mean, you don't want just something that somebody picked up off the side of a road with no story behind it or that they were drunk. So, most of them involve the police who've come and taken witness testimony. People were there. They almost all have had an object seen, classic kind of observations. And the majority of the ones that I've been looking at are things that are dropped off of these things, like leftovers or exhaust or detritus that's tossed out.
Particularly molten metals, if I
Molten
understand,
metals. I
which
have
is
5 different cases of molten metals that people have seen something drop from the craft or objects, whatever they are. I call them craft. That's making an assumption. These objects, and then you go and you find 30 pounds of molten metal in the middle of the field, right? And so, or something drops and it shatters and spews metal all over the place. And so, while none of those materials that I have themselves look like technology, right? Not like circuitry or anything like that. Not like somebody dropped a radio transmitter overboard and it exploded or shattered on the ground where you can pick up the pieces and say, oh, wow, here's a this, here's a that. Now, these are all molten metals, but what I've done is started a data collection of, well, okay, well, what are they made of? What kind of metals? And um, what are the so-called contaminants? Are they a pure metal or do they have other things in them? And then you can go a level below and look at what are called the isotope ratios. And the isotope ratios might tell you something. And without going into a whole chemistry discourse of it, the isotope ratios of iron or magnesium are the same on one side of the planet versus the other, but they might shift just like 0.001% here or there. Uh, and those are indicative of actually what part of the planet it came from, it turns out. And so, but if the isotope ratios are grossly off, it means it either came from the other side of the galaxy, perhaps, or somebody manufactured it as such. So, in one of the materials, we found magnesium ratios that were just way off, just way, way off. They just couldn't be. natural. And so that's not an indication that it came from a UFO. It is an indication, though, that somebody did it for a purpose, or it's the byproduct of an industrial process that caused it. And so, okay, fine, Garry, what does that mean? Well, why would anybody do it? We don't use isotopes for anything other than to blow things up, right? Or occasionally for anti-cancer. And they're always radioactive. All the isotopes that we use are radioactive. Uranium, plutonium, et cetera. We purify, we spend bazillions of dollars purifying this stuff so we can blow something up on the other side of the planet. I mean, that's sick, but that's the truth. But we have no understanding really of why you would alter or use magnesium-24 versus magnesium-26, at least until recently. Now, more recently, we understand that there are subtle differences that these isotopes have. They're actually useful for certain kinds of photonic or qubit purposes for quantum computers, or for structuring an enzyme with a metal core that might be a little bit more active because you're using magnesium-26 versus magnesium-24, et cetera. So there are subtleties to the use of isotopes that we're only just now beginning to appreciate. But again, it's for me, this is let's say the discoveries that we've made have been really all about, some of these materials are ultra pure, like silicon, that is 99.999% silicon. I mean, why would you blow a piece of silicon up like that over a beach in Brazil? Why? And there's chunks of it. Why? You know, I'd go to my friends down in Silicon Valley and say, wow, we'd love to have that. How did they make that? Or metals that are incompletely mixed, dumped in a field. Why? And so it's not an answer that I'm looking to create. I'm not a conclusion I'm looking to create. What I often tell people is the mistake that they make, this is something, frankly, that Jaques taught me, is don't come to a conclusion. Don't try to convince somebody of a conclusion, because it's so easy to disprove a conclusion. But if I can convince you that the data is real, that's where you hook a scientist. And that's where you hook any inquisitive mind. If I can convince you that these observations are real, if I could convince you that observations of lights or things in radar readings are real, and if I can stop you from using all the standard debunkers rhetoric, like it's unlikely. Well, but we're not playing unlikely here. We're playing what is it? And you don't get to dismiss something as unlikely in science. Until you can dismiss it with formal logic, it stays on the table as an opportunity.
And on that note, Garry, I mean, this idea of what is it, what's it for? The fact that the many accounts of molten metal falling from these things, we won't say craft, you know, in some sense that appears to be some sort of offloading, some sort of exhaust, whatever it may be. You know, it doesn't look like there is a weapon or an explosion, a purposeful weapon-like explosion taking place in any of those stories. You know, there really is a lack of logic to that. And I know they don't prove anything, as you say. What questions for you do these material raise? What's their significance? And what research does this beg for the future, as I'm sure more and more of these materials will be brought in for analysis now that Congress are up in arms on this?
Well, the first part is that we've now, with like 5 of the materials, 3 of them are aluminum. Okay, so why? And 2 of them are like iron containing. So, okay, does that mean all the ones that are aluminum were part of a common process to produce? You know, is it like, hey, if we have too much of this stuff, we got to offload it?
You're talking about exhaust here, byproducts.
Exhaust, some sort of exhaust, or some sort of, like, you know, it's like, okay, we've used up whatever goodies were in it that we needed, and now we're just going to throw it away. You know, I mean, That's fine. I mean, I set fire to a forest, but they're offloading, but that's what it is. Or if iron and aluminum are equally usable in the same process, but perhaps differently, one is kerosene and the other is, jet fuel. Um, what are the differences in the machines that are generating it or using it? So if I'm just thinking about propulsion, but maybe there's half a dozen other things that it could be important for. I don't know. But again, that's the reason for getting a detailed analysis out there with as much data as can be reasonably produced with today's technologies or analysis tools is I don't have all the answers, but there's lots of smart kids out there. And maybe one of them will come up with a reason for it. So just getting the data out, I think, is as important as, and say, this is the data that's real, and here's the evidence of what we've got. I don't know what the heck it means. You help me. What's the collective conscious interpretation?
Well, and you've been very public, and the fact that this was a great reason for you to come forward and be public about your interest in this as a very well-respected scientist. And despite all of the sniping that you've taken for it, you said it's been far more productive than any of that negativity, because you've been contacted by some amazing young students, some brilliant scientists, some great funders, and the whole thing's moving forward. So, congratulations on your bravery there, Garry. And it just brings me to my last question, because I know you've got to go. I just wanted to quickly ask, in your time speaking to physicists and aeronautical engineers like Hal Puthoff, Bigelow, Steve Justice, have you had any insight into these commonly seen 5 observables? So anti-gravity lift with no visible propulsion, sudden and instantaneous acceleration, supposedly beyond our laws of physics, hypersonic speed with no signature, so no boom, no vapor, no exhaust, low observability, and transmedium travel. These 5 features that I know Louis Elizondo has spoken about, very, very vociferously, that these are the weird things that we're after, also for ourselves, because this could solve problems for us. In your opinion, are these more likely to be features of something not functioning fully in reality as we know it? No, a phenomenon of consciousness or interdimensionality and, a kind of advanced projection, as Jack put it? Or are they more likely to be just drawing on physics that we don't yet understand, like, I don't know, the quantum vacuum or plasma scale energy, which is the kind of technologies that recent patents are now researching? What have you garnered? I know it's not your field, but what have you garnered in your chats with some of these brilliant, brilliant scientists?
Well, I mean, if I listen to some of the things that I've heard, is that in a way we can dispense with their only projections. There are examples of things that we seem to be able to replicate. If I believe the things that people who I would otherwise, as scientists, believe what they have to say, that you don't require an alternative power source projected from the 98th dimension to run these things. You can plug into it locally and use these. So I think the long and the short of it has to be that it's just physics we don't understand.
Did they mention the quantum vacuum or plasma stuff or anything else?
We talk about the quantum vacuum a lot because we have to figure out where the energy is coming from. And the only place, since they don't seem to be carrying their own batteries, that the only place they can be drawing this energy from is, locally somehow and somewhere. And the only energy source that I'm aware of, and I could be completely wrong, is the 0-point field. But there could be other energy sources we just don't understand, just there for the taking. So, a lot of people would poo-poo the 0-point field as a place because they say you just can't crack that barrier. Well, maybe there's some other, or maybe as I spoke to one of these physicists, I said, so they're cheating somehow. He said, yeah, they're cheating.
Well, certainly, there's a lot of really interesting patents out there at the moment. There's Salvatore Pace with the Navy, with his plasma compression fusion device. Crazy claims going on. That'd be great to see what his research comes up with. Other ones which are talking about the generation of gravity waves, inertial mass reduction. I mean, if this could be made real, this could really, really solve a lot of our problems for humanity. Well, listen, Garry, I want to make sure you get a break before your next meeting. So it just it just leaves me to thank you on behalf of the listeners for your time. Thank you for going deeply into the hard science, the small amount of hard science on this that we can actually get our teeth into. And I just wanted to also mention that Michael Shermer, the great skeptic, was on the show in this series. And he was saying, oh, I would love to speak to Garry and to Diana. And I just wanted to say that Michael, I think, would be interested to talk about this. And I think you could make this Kuhnian point about the fact that, well, listen, we can't make any conclusions, but this data in itself needs to be spoken about by people like you. And he's a member of the Galileo project, like yourself. So yeah, maybe consider talking with the skeptics as well, Garry, because they're
I always do. I'm a skeptic.
Yeah,
I'm asking
absolutely.
myself each day, do I believe what it is that I think I'm seeing? And how can I explain it otherwise than the most incredible change in human perspective?
We can't be scientific without skepticism.
Yeah. I mean, the opportunity to me is far more interesting than just falling prey to the delusion of depression that the world is coming to an end. I like to think that somebody else, if these things are real, somebody else got over the inflection point of destroying themselves. So that's hope to me.
And Avi Loeb's discovery on the bottom of the ocean in the Papua New Guinea, I imagine he was straight on the plane to your lab. He probably didn't even go home. Did you have a look at his ampules?
I haven't. I've looked at his data. I've looked at his data. I mean, look, again, he has the same kind of righteous indignation that I do when somebody says, "How dare you ask the question?" And like I said before, if the data keeps the question on the table, then there's no reason to think otherwise. And if nobody else is going to ask the question, why shouldn't I? And
could your instruments determine if this was from outside of the solar system or not?
No, I don't think there's any instrument on the planet that. Well, yes, I think his data already suggests that it's a good. It is supportive. I mean, any good scientist would say that the data supports the hypothesis. It doesn't prove the hypothesis. The only proof is if you actually tracked the damn thing, from beginning to end.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Garry Nolan. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.